There we go. All right. So we're going to do the make a circle challenge here. We're going over it. So we look over here. So we have seen the, you may have previously seen the border radius property. If not, let's check it out. So I'm going to check it out right now. So it defines the radius of the element's corners. So a radius of 0 doesn't give us any radius. The greater the radius, the more it kind of curves. And you can even set two values. The first one is for the top and bottom borders. The second is for the left and right borders. So you can make something that looks like a slug. Sounds good. So I'm going to fork this into my account. Getting the photocopier with the fork in it. I don't know why there's a fork in it. Oh, right, because it's forking. Oh my God. I only drank coffee a little while ago. And I'm going to git clone it down to my computer and open it up. So we're already given an index.html file. And it says we're going to use an internal style sheet for this one and the main thing. So first off, we need to make a square, and they give us some CSS to make already. So I'm just going to copy it over, and then we can look at it in more detail. All right, so we've got height and width, both 100 pixels. We've got a border that's 2 pixels, it's solid, and it's aqua. The line height is 100 pixels, and text line is center. All right, so height and width seem pretty self-explanatory. We went over border last week. What does line height mean? Did anyone look into this?
It's the height of the text.
Yeah, maybe. Let's see. We have this thing right here.
Centers yeah, never mind. Go ahead.
Yeah. So here it says determines the block progression dimension of the text content area of an inline box. So that sounds about right. And then text align center. So I think we went over that one last week as well. It'll align the text, any text inside the element to the center of the element itself. So we need to create an element, HTML element here. In order for it to be affected by this CSS, what do we need to do? It says dot box. So what is that? That dot there means what exactly?
Doesn't that mean that that's a class?
Yeah, that's right. It means that whatever we're putting here is a class. And it doesn't really matter what type of element it is, so long as it has that class. It will still be affected by the same CSS stylings. I'm going to use a div in this case, just because those are kind of the generic one. I'm going to say class equals box. And I'm just going to put some text in here called box. And I'm going to open up index.html. I need to navigate into make a circle first. OK, so there's our box. It's got an aqua border. Here's our text in the middle of it. It's pretty boxy. So now it says right here, release 1. All we need to do is make a circle. And it just tells us what to do right now. We set the border radius of the square to 50%. OK, that's simple enough. Border radius is now 50%. When we do that, we have a circle. Any questions about what this is so far? OK, so now let's take over to release 2. We need to mold the circle. First one, can we make an oval? I'm sure we can. What would we need to change about this in order to change it from a circle into an oval? What's the difference between a circle and an oval?
Different height and width.
Yeah, because currently our box, which is now a circle, has the same height and width. So if we make them not match anymore, it won't be a circle anymore, it'll be a oval. So we could say change the width to 200 pixels, perhaps. And now it's an oval. So here, inspect your circle and look at the box model with the inspector. Is it rendered as a circle? Let's check it out. Right-click, hit inspect. And down at the bottom of styles, we can see our box model. And what are we seeing here? Is it rendered as a circle? Nope, it is not. We can see here it's still rendered here as a box. And we can see our content here in the center. When it gets highlighted on our screen, it's got a box around the radius right here, but it's still a box. It's just got a border that's shaped differently. And we take a look at the border. So our border radius is not technically the real border of the element per se. It's still got corners, as always. Oops. Change the background color to make something more desirable to our eyes. All right, so what's a good background color? That would go well with our aqua border.
Brown.
White smoke.
I heard brown and smoke. Let's start with brown. I heard that first. Cool. And let's see what is smoke a color that they have? Doesn't look like it.
White smoke.
Oh, white smoke. So it's kind of a grayish off-white color. Let's stick with this one. I think it matches our aqua border a little more neatly, personally. Change the color of the font to something else. Okay, so if background color changes that, what changes the color of our text?
Wouldn't it just be color?
Yep. So if you want to change the font color, you just say color. Make this teal. So now we got teal text and a white smoke background with an aqua border. All right. So this is all pretty standard with what we've done with CSS so far, right? Now we have changed the font family to something else. What is font family?
That's like whether it's Times New Roman or
Mhm.
Courier New or sans serif or whatever.
Yep, so that we would just think of that as just font. So font family we have here, and they've got like a whole list of built-in fonts that I would know by default. Let me try that again. So you got Courier New, Franklin Gothic, Impact, Arial. Let's try Impact. So it's kind of got a whole bunch of different things already here. If I use that basic one, whoop, wrong one. Okay. So you may have noticed that the list of fonts built into CSS isn't very long. Does anyone know how we could get another font that isn't one of the built-in ones?
You could use Google Fonts.
Yep, Google Fonts. It's a very cool resource. So go to Google Fonts, or fonts.google.com is what it's called. You can see here they have a whole bunch of fonts that you can use, and they have examples here. Let's find a good one. Turret Road, that looks like fun. So if I click on it and hit select this style, it'll actually show me what I need to do. So it says here, to embed a font, copy the code into the head of your HTML. So it has a link file here, href equals fontsgoogleapi.com. So this actually essentially allows us to link an external style sheet. I'm going to put that in the head. And then it says here, CSS rules to specify families. So you'd say font family, turret road, cursive. So we would just go up here, replace all this with the code from Google Fonts. Refresh the page. There it is, and it's now in turret road. So Google Fonts, very useful thing. They also have glyphs, or they show you what the glyphs look like for each of these. So if you ever want to mess around with some cool fonts, Google Fonts is a good place to start. They don't have all of the fonts, but they do have a lot of fonts. I think some of them aren't freely available. Some of them you need to pay for, but majority of them are open. Great. What questions do you have so far?
I have a question on, so one of the things I've noticed is that as web development progresses, things are getting further and further away from storing information on the, local machine. Like
Yep.
most people are using a CDN, dropping a script tag or something, and pulling in data from some other content delivery network. What's your opinion on that? Because I mean, I know it's reliable, it's stable in most cases, but I've also heard of things completely breaking because one package it disappears or one CDN goes down or something like that. What's the industry practice? Do they serve content from CDNs like that typically, or do they do kind of a mix and match? Where they store libraries locally?
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. So essentially what you're saying is that in many websites you have will have an index HTML page, but a lot of the content will come from from someplace else, from an API, or you said a CDN, a content delivery network.
Yeah, like Bootstrap. You drop a CDN link for Bootstrap for
I see.
CSS into your, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, in general, it is considered best practice to link things externally when you're using a framework such as Bootstrap or something like Google Fonts right here. You're right, there is always that chance that something will break and that you won't be able to to match things. If something goes wrong at Bootstrap's website, they won't be able to pull from there. I wouldn't say that, I'm not sure that I would consider it a weakness, because the advantage of it, I think, far outweighs the risk, because the advantage of pulling from a CDN essentially allows you to mitigate it speeds up how quickly you render things, because whenever you render a web page to a browser, essentially the browser makes multiple calls to your server for each part. So it'll make one call to your server for your index.html, another thing for your CSS style sheet, another thing for your JavaScript, another thing for each additional image, etc. So every time you do that, there are more calls put through and more strain on your server. So by linking to an external style sheet, by linking to a CDN, you are taking some of the strain off of your server, because then it's going to somebody else's server. So in this case, the example you use, Bootstrap. So in that case, a lot of the CSS and styles come from another website that you don't have to send to a browser personally, and that allows you to render things more quickly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and especially corresponding to the edge networks and everything like you're talking about earlier in AWS and stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it is possible to, again, for using something like Bootstrap, which, is anyone here not familiar with Bootstrap? I know I keep mentioning it, so I just want to make sure, would anyone like to know what Bootstrap is?
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Yeah. So Bootstrap is a CSS framework that you can put onto your HTML page. It's very, very useful because it allows you to create a fully styled web page from basically nothing, and you don't have to do a whole lot of CSS yourself. All you would need to do is just do this, link rel style sheet goes to max CDN, bootstrap CDN. The disadvantage of like if I do some big examples of Bootstrap, we can kind of see what it looks like. So essentially without any, you're going to do this later. So essentially without any styling at all, unlike on the user's part, on the developer's part, you can make a page that looks like this. It's all done through Bootstrap's API. So, it'll look something, like this. So they have a carousel page. It's very, very useful and very, very powerful. It allows you to put things, where you want them. It has built-in components that allow you to do navigation networks and everything like that. So if we inspect this page, we can kind of get a look of that. So this nav has a class called navbar expend medium, navbar dark, fixed top BG dark. So all of these classes are built into Bootstrap. And so all you need to do is select the right classes, and Bootstrap does the rest for you. But the disadvantage of Bootstrap is it makes everything look kind of samey. You can go onto the web page, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Bootstrap pages out there. And once you've seen one, you've seen them all. It can be difficult to tell Bootstrap to not do something. So like say you want to take advantage of this nav bar here, but you don't want it to be this dark gray color. It can be hard to tell it not to do that. It's hard to override it. So Bootstrap is something very useful, and if you ever need to make a website quickly, I suggest using it. But if you want to make something a little more personalized, I suggest maybe not. Any other questions? Okay. So we changed the font family. It says play with the HTML and styles. If you nest another element in the circle, what happens? All right, so if I wanted to put a second div inside of here, and just have this one say inner, like inner, let's see what happens. Well, that's interesting. So even though this div is inside of our first div, it got rendered below that. Does anyone think they have an idea of why that may have happened? The
Is it
most
because they're
interesting,
both block elements?
Yep, these are block elements. So a block element just says, all right, I'm going to be taking up as much space up here as I can. And anything after that is going to have to be put below me. So if I wanted to change that, I may do something like, I could do something, for example, that isn't specific to the box class. I could just have it affect divs. I believe it's display. We call it, let's see what happens if we make it inline display instead of block display. So now we get something very different. So it looks like it kind of shrunk everything down. So let's try inline block instead, which is kind of a combination of the two. Okay, that's a lot better. So now we can see this div is rendered here, and this one is still kind of block content, but it's still in the line. what else can we do to mess around with with this CSS? What happens if we make this second div also giving it the class of block? Does anyone have any idea what might happen? Sorry, box, not block. Let's find out. All right, so it looks like even though it still has display of inline block, it's like, okay, I can't, it doesn't seem like it can handle putting one box inside of the other box. Once you have that 100 pixels, solid, everything like that, it puts it like so. And if we take out this inline block display, kind of looks the same.
And is that because the class overwrites the div CSS that you wrote?
So if I put it back and then take a look at the styling here, we can say that they both still have display inline block. So in this case, the inline block isn't removed. It's essentially just how HTML resolved this, saying, okay, you've got one box inside of another box, and they both have, they're both the same size and the same border radius and all of that. And so it doesn't really know how to, it can't just put them both in the exact same spot. So it resolves that by putting this one below the first one. And if I force it to be inline instead of inline block, I think something strange will probably happen. So this is how it resolves it if you tell it they both have to be in the same line. And it does this. It kind of overrides, okay, we can't make both things 100 pixels. It just won't work. So we just force them into this tiny thing like this. So generally speaking, making things be inline is usually, it'll cause troubles. Block or inline block display is a little simpler to work with. And that kind of comes to our stack the circles thing right here. What if we wanted to put these circles side by side? What would we have to change? So I wanted this circle to be rendered right here next to box.
What if we set them both to display inline and then remove the nesting?
Yep, so we can start by removing the nesting. And you said put them on display inline. Let's try that. All right, so the inline display, again, kind of shrinks them down. So we make them inline block again. It renders them side by side. So the inline thing always is kind of inline when you're working with divs with set proportions, always kind of squishes them. I'm not entirely sure why. It's just how it kind of plays out. But inline block says, okay, I have a definite size for both of these things. The block part makes sure that they remain that size, and the inline part makes sure that they are both in the same line. And if I wanted one below them, I could just say, right, div bottom. And we can get this one, this class could still equal box if we want. But we could say this one in particular has a display, or it would be style equals display block. And so now this one's at the bottom. Because that inline, this one right here overrides the div class saying, the div CSS saying inline block. Great. Does anyone have any other questions about CSS or HTML? So I will say that messing around with the display, block and inline block, if you want a situation where things are side by side like this, it's not the most efficient way to do it. There are better ways to keep everything in like the specific pattern that you want. Has anyone encountered one of these? I think one of them was in one of your challenges for the weekend, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think when I did it, it was something called the wrapper, something like that. So we can like the wrapper, like so we could use like a. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I think in the other challenge, we were supposed to, yeah, the first one like front end intro, like we were supposed to work with that wrapper function, something like that, so we could move pretty much like. So I don't know if that's what you meant, like how we.
So I'm going to look for the actual thing it was talking about, positioning elements. There's the block and inline stuff. Here it is, the CSS grid. So we can take a look at it here. So positioning elements CSS used to be very difficult. It relied heavily on positioning elements relevant to other elements. So then something called Flexbox came away, and then now we have something called CSS Grid is merged as the best way to position elements on the page. Allows us to break elements up into columns and rows. So we can see here. Let's try that out. So if I wanted to, I'm going to wrap up my boxes here. I'm actually going to get rid of this display inline block. And I'm actually going to get rid of this one as well. So I'm going to put it back so it looks like this. And let's see if we can get these into a box pattern using that. So we can wrap them all in one larger div. So we can give it an ID called wrapper. And because it's an ID, we're saying, OK, this div is going to be unique. There's not going to be anything else called wrapper on this page. We got 3 divs inside of it. And all of these ones have a class of grid child. So we could add this styling to the box class, but instead I'm going to make sure that each of these have access to 2 different classes. So I'm going to call these all grid child. So if you ever want to add more than one class, you just space them out like this. So now all of these have a div called box, a class called box, and a class called grid child. And it says right here, so we can use the change the wrapper. So we could say, all right, hashtag wrapper. Display is now grid. And we have a grid template columns. So 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. So then we have grid gaps and grid template rows. So I don't want to do this exactly the same. So let's see. If I wanted to just do 2 columns, I believe it would be grid template columns, 1FR, 1FR. Let's try that. Grid gap. Let's make it 5 pixels. Grid template rows. Allow us to define our grid however we want. So if we wanted to be a 4x4 box, so grid template rows, we could call it, so they use pixels. So let's say 100 pixels, 100 pixels, like so. Let's see what happens now. OK. So they're a little bit further apart than I thought they might be, but we put them side by side using this grid. And it looks like we didn't even need to really do anything with the grid child class here. So I guess we didn't really, wasn't a problem. All right. So the CSS grid is very, very helpful. It used to be that if you wanted to do something like this, you would either have to make a table, which is a lot, uses a lot more different kinds of tags and can be kind of confusing, or you would have to use a CDN like Bootstrap, or I can't remember any of the other ones right now, but they exist. There are a lot of them out there. But now CSS has its own built-in grid system, which makes it very, very, which makes things a lot easier to style. What questions do you have about the CSS grid or anything else like that?
Is there a way to do a nested grid? Like if you wanted to nest smaller circles inside of.
Good question. I don't imagine you couldn't. We can try that. So we could say everything in our grid child class now has also display of grid. This may look very strange. Let's see if it works. So then if I did, I would have to say, all right, grid template columns. We do 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. So we're going to have 3 of them. Let's see what happens if I make this one is. So I'd want to make, so I just put each of these inside even smaller divs, like so. So I'm going to put, oh, didn't mean to do that. So I'm putting 3 identical divs inside of the first one. Let's see what happens. Okay, so we do have these 3 divs are side by side inside the larger div, just like we would with a grid. So it looks like you can nest them. Any other questions? Okay. In that case, let's take a 10-minute break. So be back here at 10:27 or 10:28 now, and we're going to do a review of HTML tag architecture, and then we're going to talk about wireframing and the DOM.